All right, welcome back to the Best Facts Apologetics Answers show. I'm here with Dr. Lydia McGrew, author, apologist. Dr. McGrew, thank you so much for continuing with this interview and for sharing your thoughts on so many different things. I want to jump ahead to your third book, The Eye of the Beholder. This focuses on the Gospel of John. Most of you are familiar with the fact that the Gospel of John has a whole lot of content that is unique compared with the synoptics, with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so the question is these undesigned coincidences that we've been talking about from the Gospels, what about John? Does John participate in any of those? Are there any undesigned coincidences in John? You definitely mentioned one in our last question, but tell me a little bit more about undesigned coincidences in John and the other Gospels and how that works with the evidence for John's Gospel and why we should believe what John is writing.
So it's easy to think that undesigned coincidences are only going to work when they're telling the same story. And many times they are telling the same story. So we just gave the example of the feeding of the 5,000, or I gave the made-up example about the bank robbery in our previous interview, where two people or two books are talking about the same event, and then you get an undesigned coincidence. But that's not the only way that they can work. And one of the really interesting things about John is that he has more undesigned coincidences for that unique material that's only in John than any other gospel. Well, how is that possible since he's telling so many other stories? And that's because in addition to undesigned coincidences within different accounts of the same story, you can get undesigned coincidences across different stories. So let me give an example of this. In John's gospel, early on in chapter 2, after Jesus has cleansed the temple, he's driven the money changers out. That was the first time he cleansed the temple. He also did it at the end of his ministry. And the leaders come to him and they kind of say, "What are you doing? Who do you think you are?" And they say, "Show us a sign of your authority to do this," because he's just created a disturbance in the temple. And he says, for the sign, he says, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." So it's almost like a riddle or something. He doesn't explain what he means. And John pauses and says he was speaking of his body, that the author says it was a prophecy of his own resurrection. This, by the way, shows that John is really scrupulous about separating what he thinks Jesus meant from what he's reporting that Jesus said. John doesn't put his own interpretations into Jesus' mouth and say, I'm going to have Jesus say that because I think that's what he really meant. No, he pauses and says, this is what he meant, but he says it as the narrator. And that's a kind of honesty that he has that I think we should notice. It's evidence for John's reliability. But
Dr. McGrew,
an aside. Yes.
I don't want to interrupt too much, but right as you say that, some other examples come to mind, like in John chapter 7. He said this concerning the Holy Spirit, whom God would give to those who believed in him. Or in John 12, 32 and 33, if I am lifted up on a cross, I will draw all men unto myself. He said this concerning the manner of death that he would die, right? So I love how your work always opens the door to more for me. That's such a, thank you.
Those are called Johanninas asides. Like an aside is when you speak separately, and that it is not, I think, recognized nearly as much. This is something Dr. D.A. Carson has brought out, though, as evidence of John's carefulness and reliability. Okay, so he says that, and then that's it, and then now let's go over to a completely different story in what are called synoptic gospels, and we could take it from Mark or Matthew. And at the end of his ministry, fast forward to the end of his ministry, so Jesus is on trial before the Jewish leaders, and they bring in witnesses who say, he said he would destroy the temple and raise it up again in 3 days. And it's like, what were they talking about? And when you read it, to my mind, it sounds like something that kind of got garbled in translation. So I call this gossip in Hidden in Plain View. It doesn't sound like something they're totally making up, because if they're totally making it up, why would they mention the raise it up again in 3 days part? That doesn't sound like it's just a threat. So it's the kind of thing that if it were nowadays, you'd be out there Googling, trying to check out the news story and figure out what did that guy really say that got confused here. But that's not explained in Matthew or Mark or Luke what that's about. It's just that bit of their testimony at the trial. You have to take the story of Jesus' trial before the Sanhedrin and put it together with the story of the cleansing of the temple and his prediction, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up, in John, from different stories. And then they fit together in an undesigned coincidence. And what had they heard? What were they remembering? What had gotten garbled over the 3.5 or 3 or 4 years in between? It was that comment he made back at the beginning. So that is why John can participate. It's part of why John can participate in so many undesigned coincidences, even while he's telling other stories, because bits from different stories can fit together.
Hey, a great resource on this topic. I'll throw it out there and then I'll ask for some of yours too. The Historical Reliability of the Gospel of John by Craig Blomberg. I've interviewed him on that book before on the radio show, not on our YouTube channel. Dr. McGrew, where else would you direct people to find out more about the historical reliability of the Gospel of John, and start with your book?
Yeah, I mean, and I do build on Dr. Blomberg's work, and he did endorse the book very positively. I'm very, very pleased and grateful at the number of good endorsements I got on the book. It's The Eye of the Beholder. The Gospel of John as historical reportage. And I've just got a lot of positive evidence in there. And I would also go back to a book that I mentioned. It's a slim little book that I mentioned earlier called Can We Trust the Gospels by Peter J. Williams. Of course, that covers the other Gospels as well. But he talks in there about things like name statistics and the name Jesus and those kinds of things that are not always used as evidences and that cover John's Gospel as well. Of course, there are many great commentaries. Dr. Carson's commentary on the Gospel of John is useful. There's a book that's really hard to get hold of, so I almost hesitate to say I'm going to send people to it. But it's called John Who Saw by Adrian Green Armitage, and it's from last century. And I dedicate, among other people, I dedicate The Eye of the Beholder to Adrian Green Armitage, because it's called John Who Saw. He talks about how John saw and bears record of what he saw. But there's a lot of great material out there, and you can use The Eye of the Beholder as a kind of a starting point and jumping off point.
Great. Hey, I haven't read that one yet, so I'll be buying it, and I can't wait to read it. All right, well, definitely don't miss our upcoming questions with Dr. McGrew. Those are coming soon.